So I'm delighted today to welcome Ben from TrueRights, and we're going to be finding out a little bit more about what TrueRights does in this really interesting space. So Ben, I wonder whether you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what TrueRights does.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. Obviously, Ben, CEO and founder of a company called TrueRights. TrueRights is a digital rights management platform built for the digital age, but also for the era of AI, with a sole purpose on trying to help talent to better own their digital presence. Now, that looks at a number of things. It looks at your IP, your digital rights, your AI rights, and everything else encompassing around how talent is exposed in the digital landscape. Now, I came from influencer marketing, and so I have 8 years in terms of building relationships amongst brands and creators. And so I've seen it in that new evolution world of what social media was and how that was built and evolved, and what the premise was around content and rights and creators and their growth in terms of like presence, I guess, online. And now we're seeing a new wave of, as we were just speaking about, AI coming in and what that might do around talent and also brands and everyone else involved for content, basically.
Awesome. Now, just to unpack that a little bit,
Yeah.
when you're talking about talent, you're talking about sort of celebrities and influencers. And can you help us kind of understand how that whole world has been changed by the advent of Gen AI?
Yeah, for sure. And so, yeah, absolutely spot on. We're talking about, and it is all encompassing, right? You know, micro influencers, nano influencers, those that don't really have a following but post any sort of creative works, all the way up to those kind of big, kind of icon celebrity level talent that we'll all be very familiar with on a global level. And I think, you know, we've got to take almost a step back slightly in terms of the industry before we dive into what the generative AI space is doing to it, because it's an operator system and there's rationale behind why. But in terms of the influencer space in general, as you would have seen over a number of years, is it's evolved quite significantly to become very important as part of media plans, marketing plans, how anyone, namely brands, communicates a certain message, typically to a certain community. And within that is credibility, there's trust, there is a newfound resonance that influencers or celebrities or talent have built. Now, that's also disregarding to an extent all the organic work that they've done and the amazing sort of talent that they've brought to life on their own accord to build their own brands. But the way in which the industry's worked over the last number of years, and gone are the days where you would pay a celebrity millions and millions of pounds to post one image on Instagram. It's now far more strategic in terms of content, creative, video, audio. How can we be all encompassing? And the influencer space has also struggled to keep up to a slight extent. You know, there haven't been the frameworks or the parameters that allow talent to have complete safety around how their IP is being used. And I'm kind of getting to the AI point here, that proliferation of AI is kind of amplify that issue slightly. But in terms of how brands typically work with influencers or talent, it would be a case of working with them to create a certain content piece or certain asset, and then asking them to use the rights for that content. And that's been a very it's been a very formal relationship over the last number of years, but that's a growing relationship in the sense that, like I said beforehand, it'd be a very transactional. You create one image for me, you post it on your Instagram. Nowadays, it's you create one video for me or image for me. Let me also take that image and video and distribute it to all my own brand followers, you know, on my website, programmatics, display ads, my own paid media. And so brands have to buy the rights for content. Now, that in itself is an industry that hasn't fully developed. And so licensing content rights has been an issue to date. No tracking, no governance, no pricing, nothing that helps talent feel assured about how their content's being used when they pass it over. Now think about AI. Now think about generative AI. Think about the proliferation of AI tools and what that means for content. And I would imagine, and what we're seeing now, is that content is easier to produce. It is, you know, there are less barriers to entry for any brand or talent or individual to create content, and it's very easy to create content at scale. Now, if I'm a talent who hasn't got control or visibility on how my rights are already being used and generative AI comes in, well, that's going to be a catalyst towards further issue in the space. And so the first thing is, how do we sort out a framework that allows talent to safely license content safely control their rights, because what we're starting to see in the generative AI space is brands starting to tap into a thing called likeness, talent likeness. And we've spoken about this before, but what does it look like to take said talent, said brand, use generative AI to put them both in the same image? And so we've got to find a way of working with talent that ensures their rights are protected, but also their rights are represented correctly within that content and tracked and priced and remunerated fairly and everything else in between. And so we're at this very interesting point right now where I think brands are very eager to try generative AI. And I can give you some examples of conversations I've had even this week around some very big retail brands and what they're doing with digital twins is what they call it, which is a very interesting phrase in itself. And talent are also very interested in learning more about it and educating themselves, because they're very aware, I think, of running their own brand, building their own equity in the space, taking the amazing work they've done to date in terms of content creation and community building and making that a bigger thing. And so how do they start to do this safely with brands, and how do they start to do it safely on their own as well?
I guess that's the beauty of this, because it's a marketplace, isn't it? You've actually got the talent who have built up their brand over sometimes many years, decades, and that's got value. And then on the other side, you've got the brands themselves, the businesses who want to use those talents, the images, the likenesses of them for effectively promotion of products. And you're sort of building a marketplace between the two to enable them to access the other. Help me understand a little bit about how it works in terms of when you start to use a Gen AI tool, because many of us will be using a Gen AI tool like Midjourney or something like that to be able to create content, and we've seen how that's working at the moment. It's pretty good at coming up with generic faces or generic people, but how good are the current tools at creating likenesses of celebrities? And is there any value in having like an 80% of a celebrity?
It's an amazing question, and there are so many facets towards this answer. The short answer is the tools are very good in the right hands, and I think what we've seen, and again, when we started this, it was kind of, not only did we see the framework issue around rights in general, but I got called into a room, and I think I've told you this, with TikTok in Culver City, and they explained to me TikTok Symphony, which is their AI solution. You take a URL from a website, it strips kind of marketing messaging, product messaging, it puts that into a creative brief, it puts it into a video, it puts an avatar on that video, and you've got an all-encompassing SaaS solution that allows you to create content seamlessly. And the issue they had was putting in IP, talent representation into that video safely, effectively, true representation, as you kind of said, around likeness. And at that point, I don't think it was it wasn't completely there, but this is 2.5 years ago, right? And now we're working with partners to license likeness to them, all approved and authorized by the talent. And to the extent that I won't tell you who, but when we are showing them these images of themselves, they are genuinely gobsmacked, because it's picking up scars on their face that they didn't think it would pick up. And again, I think if you were to use a SaaS tool yourself and go and take content and put it on there and ask for it to create an image of said person, you might not get the kind of white glove service, but you've got some amazing production houses now that are using generative AI and those tools to an extent, but have these amazing creative directors, and hence why that role is still so important for a number of reasons, but not least, I think it will become even more important in the generative AI space to know how to deploy these tools effectively. And I will share some examples with you after, and then maybe we can see if we can get the rights to share it wider. But it is a true representation, and it's very interesting to see talent talk about themselves in imagery and go, oh my God, that looks like me, which is the craziest thing, because actually, we work with a talent called Elliot, who is a fantastic talent, has been in the influencer space for a very long time, and so has kind of ridden that wave for 10 odd years, like a very early adopter of influencer marketing himself. And we went and created some imagery of him, and when we showed it back to him, his reaction, and he was voice noting me, was just of genuine amaze. It was like, I can't believe this is me. And the interesting thing was, is one or two images I didn't think looked like him. He was thinking looked really like him. So it's a real perception piece anyway. But I think in the first instance, and what we try and do at TrueRights anyway, is these tools are very powerful and they're very effective, but there is still an error of margin because they are just tools to an extent. And so the input you feed them has to be very thorough. And it's similar when you use ChatGPT and you want to, use a text to prompt, is that you've got to be very accurate with what you're writing, because otherwise it can hallucinate, or it can run off in a different kind of stream of thoughts. And so it's the same with content. If I want to go and create an image of you, Tim, I have to have the right content of you in the first place. I can't have you now and you at 15, because if I was to put that imagery into the content machine, it would hallucinate and not know what the consistencies are. And similarly, we're now getting to a point where, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't know, you might have an afro, or who knows what it was back then. But we get to this point now where you have to find consistency in the data that we're putting into it. And that doesn't just look at image anymore, things that these tools are asking for to an extent, and it is slightly intrusive, and hence kind of why we're here to protect that IP, is your height, your weight, your mannerisms, the way you walk, the way you talk, your accents, your eye color. And again, I won't say who it was who said this, but someone very influential in this space talked about it being intellectual personality as opposed to intellectual property, and how personal this data is for you. And these tools are amazing, but we've got to find a safe way of licensing this content to these tools to go and create this great content. But it really is there. And I think image definitely, audio definitely, video is still developing when it comes to likeness, because of all the complexities I've just said. How do you walk? How do you talk? The mannerisms. Look at Conor McGregor, for instance. He has built his brand off, the way he walks. Now, can you replicate that? It'd be very hard. So so we're getting there. We are getting there very, very quickly.
I love that phrase of intellectual personality. It's actually sort of movement into being able to define those individuals by not just that two-dimensional view of them, but actually a much deeper psychological profile of who they are. But just to come back to how this is Gen AI tools are using rights, can you sort of explain a bit more about what you're doing to enable your talent to work with the Gen AI tools? Because I think maybe when we spoke before, you were talking about how there is actually a need from Gen AI tools to want to access talent, because when brands come along and try to use those Gen AI tools, they want to also access the talent, but at the moment there's no sort of way of licensing the talent to be able to make those ads or the pictures that they want. So can you explain a bit more about what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, definitely. So we built a framework in the first instance about what it looks like to license IP likeness into a third party. And in these instances, those third parties are generative AI tools. And that framework really, as I said, starts at the very beginning around data structuring and IP consolidation and all the techie savvy stuff around the person themselves. And you have to structure that in a certain way. And what we've gone and done is built partnerships with 9 different generative AI tools to date that vary from production houses through to kind of self-service tools themselves. And we've asked them the question of, well, what inputs do you need that is compatible with the requirements to go and create versions of this talent? And then we structure it in that way. So if you're in 11 labs, you might need 2 minutes of audio or 10 minutes of audio, really high quality, high resolution, if you want to go for the kind of premium service. So how do we make sure we're structuring that in our product that allows us to safely license it? Now, in terms of the safely licensing piece, we actually use our own technology. We have a TrueRights stamp. It's a proprietary piece of tech that also works with industry standard bodies, C2PA, content credentials. And so we can embed licensing information into the content so that when we share it to a third party, they can also see the parameters that they can use this content within. And we're making it a legal matter now, because I think we've kind of toyed with the copyright question for quite some time. And decisions are still to be made around where we go or where we land in terms of what comes next. And so for us, it's about making sure we have legal governance and legal protection for talent that are sharing their IP to any third party, be it to a generative AI tool or be it to a brand. And so the main points here are really, you have to structure it in the first place in a way that is approved, not least around the content and a IP perspective, but we have the correct rights to, again, if I take an image of you, Tim, I have the rights to that content, you don't. And so we have to go through this real process of making sure that the content that we're using as training data or data to inform our content creation also has the right approval, because we're sharing that on someone's behalf. Then we have to build that framework, and our generative AI tools and partners actually come and they accept our framework, and we work with them to make sure that it's aligned with their processes, but is ethical and is following the right approval processes, because there are two key focuses for us. One, everything is approved and it's all copyright approved. And two, everything is authorized by the talent, because they're the rights holder, or the rights holder, I should probably say, but in 99% of the time, it's the talent. And then we obviously make sure we have that framework on our solution, on our tech, where we can license it and third parties can come and download it from our own solution, so that we know it's been fingerprinted, stamped, tracked, and we can see how they're using it. The last part of this is, and this is kind of a sneak peek behind the curtains now as to what might be coming, probably a little way off, but this is kind of what we're building towards, is what does it look like to actually have integrations with these generative AI tools? Because to the point you mentioned there, I used to work in platform partnerships, so I'd work a lot closely with the social media platforms. And again, what I saw was the approach that advertisers took when wanting to work with talent. They would go to the source of where they were distributing content or creating content, which would be, I will go to TikTok to create TikToks. I will go to Meta to create Instagrams or Facebook posts or whatever else it might be. And then they would be the parties that would then reach out to the talent agencies or the influencer agencies or the talent. And I think you'll see the same shift in the generative AI space, where brands will go to generative AI tools, as you were just saying, to create content, and they will need an easy and approved way of accessing IP, should they want to do it ethically. Big should they, I guess, in that instance, a big if, because some brands might not, but that is their prerogative. It's not mine. That's the question. And I think you'll see a lot of brands fall on the right side of this. I really do. A lot of my conversations are very positive in this space. But
that's really welcoming to hear, actually, because I think that's part of the challenge that we face as an industry, is that there's some people who are saying, well, we don't need to address this because it's not needed, it's going to stifle innovation. Actually, we feel that as most industries develop, there's always that sort of that pressure from brands driven by consumer demands to actually be a bit more responsible and more ethical. And it might be gradual, but I think brands are starting to get there now and starting to take notice.
100%. I spoke to, and I'll keep very careful with how I say everything here, because I don't want to release any trade secrets, but I spoke with H&M at the beginning of the week, who released a great press release a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, around working with digital twins and how they wanted to go and still work with models, still work with real people, and how they wanted to help guide them through a very safe process around generative AI and licensing their likeness. But it didn't just stop there. It was, when you've created that model, how do we make sure that you can store it, how you can still be remunerated for it? How can you still make commercial value off the fact that we are working with you in this new, developed, evolved way that is kind of thought leading? And when I spoke to them, it was unbelievably refreshing to hear a brand that's got amazing heritage, very traditional, retail brands, let's be honest, that is looking at these sorts of technologies evolving and is very conscious about what is happening, not just to the talent involved, but to the production sets, the people that are involved behind the scenes. How can they make sure that everyone is still involved in some way? Beauticians, people that are on set to help with, like I said, lighting, production, makeup, all of this. How do they now treat them as creative directors? How do they get them to review content after as opposed to before? This sort of thing. And so, like I said, not all brands will be like this. I think, I spoke to someone called Louise, H&M. She was a fantastic advocate for just talent, production, content in general. And like I said, it was super refreshing to have someone like that give a lot of really good nods towards how this should become the industry.
So absolutely fascinating to hear how these things are evolving, and even evolved since the last time I spoke to you. But Just talking about this, the sort of creative and the copyright debates, because I know this is something that you're very interested in, and obviously it's something that we've spoken a lot on at UKAI as well. It sounds like there's a real difference between the world that you're seeing, where both the Gen AI companies are engaging with you, and the brands are engaging with you, but then on images and music, and to a degree where there isn't any talent involved necessarily, those same companies are not engaging, and they're saying actually that the process is too hard and that they don't want to get into the licensing model. What is your perspective on that? Why is there a difference between your world and all the other creative worlds?
It's very hard to undo an industry, is what I would say in this space. And I can't talk for all of them. I think we're very fortunate and unfortunate to an extent, but we're very fortunate that we're the first to enter this market, which means that we can kind of map out, based off the conversations that we've had before and other conversations with a load of great thought leaders in the space, around what policies should represent. And so we're kind of starting afresh, which means we can rewrite it or write it for the first place. Whereas when you look at music, they've had a licensing framework in royalties for years. And by the way, it's done very well in terms of, actually make, in a lot of ways of accrediting, I would say it's done very well from that perspective. And it can be quite hard to go and undo that and unpin all of that hard work that's gone in to date, because they've got a business model that already exists. And so I think the difference for us is that there hasn't been a framework, a technology, a marketplace to an extent that is built around content and image. And I think that's actually a benefit that we can lean into a little bit at the moment, that allows us to rewrite what the rules should be when setting policy on it. And I think that's where we are at an advantage compared to the other creative industries.
And I think it comes back to the point you were making before, actually, about certainly not diminishing the other types of creative assets, but they are outputs from a person, right? And they are the property, the intellectual property you mentioned before. Whereas you're dealing with the intellectual personality, you're with the actual person itself, and so there's something much more personal, much more unique. That if you are actually going to try and sell yourself, then there's a lot more law and ethical need to engage with that person properly to do that than there would be about just accessing something which that person has created.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think it is very personal. And maybe this is, and again, I can't comment specifically, but maybe this is also the difference when it comes to music or those sorts of similar industries, is that voice is one component of, and it's a very important component, don't get me wrong. And I think we've seen the Make It Fair campaign, we've seen amazing talent, agencies, representatives all stepping up for, I believe, the exact right points, and I'm completely in alignment with that. But when it comes to your face, when it comes to everything all encompassing, how we typically identify a lot of people, it can be very intrusive. And so I think maybe, and this is just a guess, there is being more scrutiny around that, because there's more risk to an extent. And I don't mean commercially, I just mean personally. And so I think that's kind of where the difference is kind of coming through in this industry anyway.
Yeah, and it's obviously a digital copy. I mean, you're calling it a digital twin, and that's what the brands are buying into it. This kind of point of having 80% of your celebrity isn't good enough. You want it to be as accurate as possible. So I think that's also a key difference. Whereas with other creative assets, what the argument is that they're not directly copying it; they're using it as input data, etc. So there's those kind of structural differences. So I just wanted to also kind of pick up on how you're seeing this on a sort of global perspective as well, because I know you've been, I think, traveling around the world, so taking this. So are you seeing differences or particular markets which are more embracing? Is this something which is taking off in the US? Is the UK leading? Give us a bit of perspective on where's the hotspots right now.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it also comes down to general industry ambition sometimes, and I mean that as positively as I can. I've been traveling in the US for a little bit, and I think the general conversation I've had there is very forward thinking. It is very much, how do we do this actually with some safe parameters, because we want to be able to move quickly and at scale. And so doing the legwork now will allow us to do that when the time is right. And that kind of change in philosophy around, it's not just one tool that needs to be involved. There might be a handful of that start at the beginning of the process and also, finish the end of the process. And so I've been working or speaking to a lot of copyright based companies over in the US that, for instance, you can do all the content creation and you can feed everything you need to feed into it, but then can also accredit and approve copyright at the end by putting images into certain scanners that allow you to go, oh, Ben's wearing a Nike t-shirt, that is copyright. Or, this looks like said person, to your point, 80% likely. And so I think the one big difference I've seen, and it is US versus Europe, I would say to an extent, although there are some markets in Europe that are starting to really push ahead in terms of thought leadership. Kind of France, I think, is doing quite a lot in this space in terms of tech and enabling. But the US is very ambitious on it. And I think they're the ones that are seemingly, for my space anyway, trying to find solutions for it. Look at I think they've also got to find solutions for it. I think if you look at some of the intermediaries over there, like how big production has been over there for the likes of Hollywood and LA. You look at SAG-AFTRA, who went very early in terms of the strikes and for the union. I think they have already started to be affected by this to the point where they've got to find solutions that resolve it and move the market forward quite quickly. I think what we've seen over here in the UK, and this is, in the most positive light as I could say it, is a slight lack of, not ambition, but decision making, I think, around where we sit on this. And look, we're not going to get it right first time. I know that there are some things that you can't undo, but what can we be doing in the short instance to, and I'm talking here specifically about talent, because I know we spoke about other industries, and so I can only talk for the industry I've been involved in, but what can we start doing in the first instance to put things in place to protect talent, to help tools, to educate? These conversations are amazing. I know that you yourself and UKAI do a lot around kind of facilitating that educational conversation. But we're not talking about you here. We're talking about brands. We're talking about talent, the industry itself. And I think there's a lot of waiting, basically. Whereas in the US, there's a lot of like, let's try it out. Let's see how it works. As long as we've got the right approvals, yeah, okay, we'll see how it goes. And it's just that kind of shift in mindset that I'm seeing from that side compared to where we are.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear the difference in those kind of approaches and the way in which the US is. I think that is part of their culture often, isn't it? Just to kind of
100%.
stuck in, try it, fail fast. If you fail, that's kind of like that's a learning. Whereas I think over here in the UK, I've faced it, and I'm hearing a lot from other people as well, that we have this kind of culture of being more risk averse, and we don't want to change and pivot quite as much as they do in the US. A last sort of question on this, and then we'll start to wrap things up. But do you think that is also why I was going to almost kind of preempt the question. Do you think that we can have more Gen AI companies and language models coming out of the UK, or do you think that that race has already kind of happened with what's happened in the US? They've got the models, and now our role in the UK is almost to build the sort of the application layer on top, or build the marketplaces like you're building.
Yeah, I think we can. I think you have seen a handful of good tools. Like I think Synthesia might even be UK born, and what those, they're just in a massive raise. They've been very well established. They found a real niche in terms of where they're using generative AI for content. And so I think the large language models, the question also comes down to who wants to enter that market. If looking at it from a business perspective, how many do you need? Where's the niche? Is there good market entry? I kind of look at all those questions and think I can't see any real opportunities to go and do something similar or of that nature at the moment. But what I am seeing is a lot of good production studios or generative AI creative arms that are coming out in the UK. Some of them are partners. We've got UK partners as well as also global partners, and they are finding specialisms in certain verticals. And so we work with a company called Leapfrog, and they are centered around fashion and AI. And so they want to help production across stock imagery. How can we reduce the amount of time that it takes to actually put digital avatars or twins or whatever else it might be into certain new clothing lines and all this sort of stuff. And that's very forward thinking. And so I think you'll see just pockets of innovation that come from this, similar to kind of what we're doing, I guess, that provide safety and reassurance, but also allow for and enable scale within this space. And so I think you'll still see that. I think the UK is still a very strong market for that. I think the conversations I'm having are broadly positive. So yeah, it will be interesting to see what else pops up. I think the LLMs that are already out there are already doing a pretty good job to an extent in terms of the service they're providing. Whether they're doing IP and copyright correctly, I'm not too sure at the moment, but we'll see how that evolves.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into it.
Awesome. Well, that's been so interesting. I mean, Ben, we could spend so much time chatting. I always enjoy kind of finding out what you've been up to because it's amazing. So I'm glad we've managed to capture this one on the podcast today. Just before we go, tell us how we can find out more about what you're doing at TrueRights and how we can stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Well, easiest place is to go to the website, TrueRights.com. Obviously, feel free to reach out to me. We've got an amazing team on our side that is educating all stakeholders within this space. We are built in theory for the protection of talent. And like I said, it's not just AI, it is just their rights in general around digital, and that era of AI is starting to kind of creep in. So we need to be very careful around how we position ourselves and what we are doing now for the future. But yeah, definitely come to the website. We have a few initiatives that are going live relatively soon as well that will be announced in various different places and with various different partners within the talent space as well. So I'm sure you'll see some things, but otherwise LinkedIn's a great place, or come through UKAI.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Amazing.
So yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I look forward to getting you back in the future and hearing how things are progressing and getting you involved in the UKAI community. So thanks very much, Ben.